Hi, Kevin.
Hey, hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing perfectly fine.
Well, it's good to see and hear you. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, um, available on audio podcast as well as video streaming if anyone's curious. And you're Kevin Kelly. And I guess it's fair to call you a tech visionary. That's probably been said about you, has it not?
It has. I won't object to that.
Okay, good. Well, when I say things you object to, feel free to object. But so far we're good. So you were a founder, one of the founders of Wired. You were
That's
executive
correct.
editor of Wired for a long time. You've written a number of books, including Out of Control. And if I might pause here for a moment of self promotion, when the movie The Matrix was being made, the directors had Keanu Reeves read three books. One was your book, Out of Control. One was my book, The Moral Animal. One was a book by a snooty French philosopher who wound up complaining that the directors had not appreciated the profound significance of his work, even though his book was, I believe, actually shown in the movie.
Yeah,
You
right.
talk about your whiners.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I watched all three of the Matrices trying to figure out what influence my book had, and I think it was in the closing spectacle of this sort of high creature thing that was going to, I don't know, take over the world in some
This
ways.
this creature thingy,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
leads us naturally to your new book, which we're going to talk about, The Inevitable: Understanding the 12 Technological Forces That Will Shape Our Future, in which it talks about how we're all going to become one giant creature thingy,
Yeah, exactly. Right.
right?
So yeah, I think the Matrix has had it down. You can just watch the Matrix, I think.
No, we want them to read the book. And I don't want to do any plot spoiling here on the book, but people are curious, I'm sure. What is inevitable, Kevin?
I think, first of all, the book dwells primarily about the digital technological realm. I don't talk about energy, biological tech, which is vast. And I think most of the future is inherently, fundamentally unpredictable, and in particularly the specifics, the sort of the particular species level. But I think there's another aspect of technological, which is sort of this long range direction. And those are the things that I think we can forecast. The analogy I like to use is imagine this really large valley and it's raining in the valley, and you're going to follow one particular drop of rain. The path of that particular drop is inherently fundamentally stochastic. It is unpredictable, but the direction is pretty inevitable, which is down.
Mm-hmm.
So there's kind of like a gravity, and so I'm interested in the sort of the that large inevitable directions in the technologies, which are coming from the inherent physical makeup of all these technologies, including, by the way, bits and um, intangibles like that. They all ride on a very physical structure of wires and switches and stuff, and this gives it the leanings that it has. And so, what I would say are inevitable are the general forms that we see, in the same sense that I would say that telephones were inevitable once you had electricity. Uh, any planet in the galaxy you're going to go visit to, they have electricity. They're going to have phones. The internet's inevitable once you have phones. The particular internet, the particular phone system, the character, the quality, none of these things are inevitable at all. They're all something we have choices in. They make a huge difference to us. But the fact that you're going to go through this progression, I think these are inevitable. And
Mm-hmm.
so, what I would say is, in a sense, greater and greater cognification, more and more artificial minds, more and more mindfulness, more and more cognition in different things is inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
As long as we're kind of doing civilization, we're going to do more and more of that. That's inevitable. The character, quality, the specifics, none of that is
So
inevitable.
it wasn't inevitable that the iPhone would be available in rose gold.
No. And it
Okay.
wasn't. And while the internet was inevitable, Twitter was not.
Okay.
Twittering every 15
And the
minutes is.
iPhone per se was not inevitable, but some device functionally kind of like that was pretty likely.
Yeah, something. A cordless portable phone, yes.
Mm-hmm.
So it was on the level of, in biological terms, it's almost on the level of a genre, of a class. But the species level is not predictable. But the higher level organizational forms, bilateral symmetry, quadrupeds, those kinds of things, those are inevitable. And by the way, as you know, I'm talking to the right guy here, but the idea of this sort of directions in evolution is it's not universal in biological thinking. It's a minority view, but I adhere to the idea that there actually are directions.
Although I actually think when you state it clearly enough, it wins more adherence within biology. I mean, if you make it clear that you're not saying that complexity inevitably rises within any given lineage. It's just that on balance, over time, the most complex organism tends to get more complex in the long run and things like and certain properties. And here we get to, I think, an analogy with your argument with technology. Certain properties were likely to be invented, like winged flight has been multiply invented by evolution. So it's probably pretty likely and so on. Right. Now, you use the raindrop as an example of something whose downward trajectory was pretty much inevitable. I would say, with your book, we're mainly talking about an upward trajectory. You're optimistic, right? And I want to talk about that and probably give you a little pushback in the course of this conversation. But I also want to first flesh out a little more in the way of the inevitability. You write near the end of the book. You write, "We are marching inexorably toward firmly connecting all human and all machines into a global matrix." Not a matrix exactly in the sense of the movie The Matrix, but the idea, I mean, do you kind of mean like a giant global superorganism here?
I do, yeah. So I think this is sort of the unseen narrative story of our time. Unseen in the sense that right now it's hard to visualize. It's hard to picture that, in fact, we have made a mechanical system that's connecting all these machines that we have, and indirectly the whatever it is, 5 billion people who are online with phones and not, and all the technological trends that I see going on will increase those connections over time, and both physical time and also the amount of time that we spend each day connected in some way, and so we don't have the vocabulary to describe what that is. So organism is maybe one term, a machine is another, and as you know, I favor this idea that the differences between organisms and machines is very slight. So there might be something in between that we come to call this, and I think that this system, we'll call it a system for now, will exhibit certain behaviors that are not present in the individual parts, and so this is where we get the word of the superorganism, that there is a sense in which it is behaving in its own manner and with certain recurring patterns. And so I think we have very little clues about what that might be like, but I see every evidence that that's where we're headed.
And I guess in a certain sense you could say that with the one part of the superorganism idea is that the functionality moves to a higher level of organization. So we build and become part of a kind of a brain that is now taking care of planet Earth. I mean, our brains take care of us. And, smaller social information processing systems and political systems maybe take care of the society. But we're talking about something planetary here, right? And there's...
Right. And so I see it as a kind of a triune sense in which not only is the technology connecting the humans together, but also as we embed sensors and as we have effect at the planetary scale on the planet, that we also that the Gaian aspect of the planet, the weather, the atmosphere, all these things become part of this organism, machine,
Right.
whatever you want to call it, the system. And so it's very clear that we collectively have an effect on the planet, and the planet has an effect on us, of course. And now this machine that we're making, this third leg, so to speak, is also part of this this very, very large planetary system. And there will be many ways to view that, and we're at the very beginnings of this. And so what I'm trying to argue is no longer just a metaphor, that we actually can treat this as a scientific idea that can be verified by evidence or not, that we should be thinking about ways to measure and test, say, the theory. But at the same time, as you said, if it's happening at the planetary scale, if there is emergent phenomena, then that means that almost by definition we may not be able to detect or comprehend or understand some of those things that happen. And so that will be part of what we kind of have to look forward to. And this is where we drift into the idea that I would call that a kind of a soft singularity, in a sense of not this kind of information intelligence explosion, but the sense of having something happening at a higher level of scale that simply is really kind of unknown to us.
Right. So the extreme version of or one version of the singularity idea is that, well, first of all, things are moving faster and faster, and we're approaching a point beyond which it's impossible to see. It's impossible to kind of conceive of what's going to be beyond this point. That's beyond us. But there is this assumption or faith or something in the standard singularity hypothesis that whatever it is, it's going to be good, right?
Well, and whatever it is in some way transcendent, not just yes, good, but also transcendent. Part of the what I would call the hard Ray Kurzweilian version of the singularity is what they would call an information explosion, and there's a curious assumption about it, among many other things, which is that intelligence is infinite or can be infinite, which is there's no evidence that that's actually true. We don't have infinite temperature, we don't have infinite coldness, we don't have infinite speed. Why should intelligence be infinite? So I think the idea that it's benevolent is actually not assumed. A lot of singularities, and people like Elon Musk and others, right. Nick Bostrom, are saying, well, actually, it's much more likely it is not. So I would say the idea of this kind of intelligence explosion has a probability greater than zero, but I think is very, very unlikely, to worry about. But because it's greater than zero, I think, well, yeah, it's an existential issue. So it's, you should give it as much attention as you might anything that's greater than zero.
Yeah, and I want to get into this question of what are the grounds for thinking that this will be good in the long run, as opposed to it being either dystopic or as opposed to us, say, blowing up the planet. But first, let's talk a little about the texture of the book. So you've got 12 chapters. All of them have a one-word title that ends in ing. What's the logic behind that? So things like cognifying, flowing, screening, sharing, filtering, and so on.
Well, there's a couple of things going on there. One is these are, I don't even know what the technical term is, present participles, gerunds.
I was thinking gerund, but I'm out of my depth.
Yeah, it doesn't really matter. What it is indicates that there's this constant ongoing motion, that these are processes rather than products or nouns. And one of the things one of the verbs is about this shift from a world in which things are static and fixed to this fluid liquid world where the emphasis is on processes. And so you have the shift in our economy from products to services. You have the shift from products to processes, up and down. You have the shift from the tangible world of atoms and manufacturing to the intangible world of design and digital bits. And so that's the larger reflection that I'm trying to show is that these are processes that are already going on right now. I'm not suggesting that these are things that are going to happen. I'm saying no, they're in process right now. They may be faint, and what we're going to see is an increase in their complexity, density, diversity. And secondly, that there isn't really an end point. There's no omega point that we're headed to. These are directions. These are movements, and they're not even about the particulars. They're about a general trajectory.
Funny you should say that. Use the term omega point, because that is famously associated with this theologian, this Catholic mystic theologian and paleontologist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who wrote about 100 years ago about this stuff, and had a vision that in some ways resonates with yours, right? Building toward what could be called a kind of a giant superorganism, and he did see a culmination. Of course, this was a theological matter for him ultimately, a culmination in something called Point Omega. But you see this going on forever.
Yeah. So I think Chardin was in some ways captured by a very common, what I would say, misconception about evolution. And the misconception of evolution is that it's a ladder climbing up and up, and that it is that in some senses you could say that there's a single dimension, and we talk about higher things evolving higher. The proper visualization of evolution is a point radiating outward, further and further. Mm-hmm. And so every single species alive today on this planet is equally evolved. Every single one of them, including the cockroach and the clam, has undergone 4.5 billion years of evolution. And so we're all equally evolved, anything that's alive right now. So it's a radiating thing outward, and the only thing there is a direction.
Right.
That direction outward. It's not a ladder going up.
And they're all. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. And so the omega point has this idea that we're on a ladder and we're going to reach to some end point. And I'm saying there is no end point. And in my view, the technology is an extension of the same fundamental self-organizing principles underlying natural selection and evolution, and that it's also radiating outward. Right. That there's all these outward radiating, and there's directions going in that thing, but there's no endpoint, there's no destination, it's a direction.
Although, of all these species, only one so far has gotten to the point where it's set in motion a technological evolution that could then kind of be parallel with evolution, right? I mean, which I don't think was inevitable that our species would do it, but if you step back and see this thing as directional in some sense, that it's an important part of the direction that one species or another was likely to launch this second kind of technological evolution that your book is about, right?
Yeah, I don't actually see it as necessarily in parallel. I see it as very much as the seventh kingdom of life, as an extension of the things. And it's the way I would sort of imagine, and here we'll talk about AI a little bit, is that what we're going to be doing, we humans, with our technology, is basically in making kinds of minds that biology itself alone in its tissue form could not get to. So we're going to basically in populate the space of all possible ways of thinking with species of mind that could not be done if you just relied on DNA. In the same way that we have invented other ways of flying besides flapping wings and gliding. We invented artificial flight, which entails strapping a barn door on a jet engine and flying. It's a crazy way, but we have actually been involved in populating, so to speak, the possible ways to fly lighter than air with a species that we could not get to just with DNA. And so it's not just a parallel thing, it's actually an extension of the very process of evolution itself.
Okay. So speaking of AI, one of your chapters is called Cognifying, and that's largely about AI. And you posit a lot of uses of AI that range from the grand, as you kind of just alluded to, like I think you see AI as playing the lead role in future scientific breakthroughs, like maybe the human mind just can't get quantum gravity, and AI can. And then but you go all the way to the very pedestrian, like there will in some sense, I gather, be intelligence embedded in our clothes, such that our clothes will tell the washing machine how they should be laundered, kind of, right?
Yeah, and whether it actually resides in our clothes or not is sort of not important. In fact, because one of the things I'm suggesting is that the AI is a commodity utility like electricity that for the most part will become invisible and that we aren't really necessarily generating, but it's something being served to us when we need it. And so whether the smartness of your shirt really resides in the shirt itself or in this organism, this system, is sort of not important. But yeah, most of the AI in our lives, most of the cognition will be invisible to us. It's going to be in the back rooms. It's going to be like electricity is, or motors, where they're very effective mostly because we don't have to deal with them, we don't see them. There'll be another portion of it that will be, consumer facing, and I think those are probably we'll interface that with them in a conversational sense of them being present. We'll have an awareness of their presence. And when people ask about what's the future of the internet, I think the future of the internet is sort of like it's a presence that is there that we converse with, and so that would be, for most people that would be the way that we deal with it. But most of the time, most of the AI is going to be like electricity. It's going to be running, and it's going to be succeeding because we're not aware of it. It's because it's in the background.
Now, it seems to me one of the main, if not the main, portals of AI, and I think this is still almost underrated by some people, as kind of obvious it is in another sense, is all these like Siri, Amazon Echo. And so, I mean, just today I read that, okay, Google has come up with this Allo, I guess, messaging app, and in that they're going to embed this Google Assistant thing that they want to transcend all these different kinds of they want it to be, on the one hand, in your home, like Alexa, like the Echo, and they want it to be in your phone, and they want it to be in your messaging system. And so it seems to me like in a way, the biggest race on in tech now is to be the company that becomes the go-to AI provider. And it seems to me like there may just be one winner, because when you think about it, it's like once you're in third place or second place, it's tough because you just don't have as much information. And that's why I'm betting on Google. Google has so much more information about us already than any other of these companies. And so they're in better position to predict what we want, to know what we want, and provide it. And anyway, there's a lot of... So anyway, I think it's a mistake to keep thinking of AI as robots. I'm sure you appreciate that. But even the movie Ex Machina, which is a very good movie, was still kind of seeing AI as like in a robot. Yeah. I think AI is like, it's here and we're all starting to use it. And I guess one of these questions, we talked about utopia or dystopia, and you come down for what you call protopia, I think, which is more or less good, incremental progress, relax.
Yeah.
But what about even that issue? Like, do you want one company being the pipe into the brains of every human in the world?
Right. So you're right that in fact there's only likely to be one or two winners. It's a winner-take-all network effects in AI, in specific kinds of AI, and there's, in some senses, there AI will be one of the most clear cases of network effects, because in a network effects was the fax effect, right? And the more people that use the fax machine, the more attractive it became. The more people who joined it, the more you became. Each user became a missionary and evangelist to get more people on. So there was the more people on, the better it became. Well, AI is especially that, because the more people that use an AI, the smarter it gets. So we're going to see a fantastic network effects, accelerating returns, cascading snowball, where the few that are ahead are going to become really, really big. And that would be, as you say, bad news for civilization if that was the end of the story. But here's a couple things. One is, right now, the way neural nets work, which is the fundamental breakthrough in AI, and all the things that are happening right now are because of neural nets. Neural nets require these very large data sets to train. You need, it turns out, not just thousands of examples to train them on every example, every case, but maybe even millions. And so the companies that were sitting on these huge data sets, like Google, are the obvious winners because they have data sets on every single possible aspect of our lives. That's what we've been training them. Each time we click on a website, we're actually training the Google AI about what's important. So that would seem to be the end of the story. But let me say a couple things about these natural monopolies in the digital world, which is that they're very ephemeral. Is that they don't last very long because something else comes along that just really blows them out of the water. So while they're there, actually, I think they're very, very useful. I think it was fantastic that Microsoft was the monopoly in the OS for a while, because there was such a large ecosystem that it could make. It wasn't going to last long. It was displaced by Google, who came along. And just a second, and then Google seems to be the monopoly everybody is both wants to emulate and wants to tear down. And then Facebook is taking over that dominance. And what's going to happen with AI and Google is that the real breakthrough, the next breakthrough after this first generation, which may last, I don't know, 5 years or 5 to 10 years with Google, the breakthrough that's coming after that is to do really small human scale training sets. A human toddler can learn the difference between a cat and a dog with 12 examples. Right now, it takes Google millions of examples. And so when you have that, then you don't need the large data sets.
Okay, let me.
And so what we're going to see is, yes, Google will have its reign as an AI monopoly for a short period of time, and then the next breakthrough will come, and there'll be some little small company that will figure this out that won't need the big data sets that Google has, and then that'll have a new monopoly as more people use that. It gets smarter and smarter.
Okay, let me provide this pushback. So first of all, it's true that Microsoft's dominance didn't last forever. However, its dominance of the desktop was never displaced. What happened is that something displaced the desktop. And
Exactly.
while it dominated the desktop, which continues this day, its monopoly status meant that it screwed up the lives of millions of people every day. And I'm not kidding. I mean, I use Windows. It is much worse than it would be if it really had to compete, rather than be able to take my my patronage for granted. Okay, so there's that. So the question,
why are you using Windows? I mean, that's
because once you're locked in, you're locked in. And also, I don't think Mac is as great as the Crusaders, the Mac faithful say, but Microsoft is just. But this is nothing. So first of all, I mean, I think we agree, it's not necessarily that you won't dominate the platform forever. It's that the platforms have tended to give way to more important platforms. So like now social networks.
They're displaced. They have their reign. So again, it was Microsoft was never toppled by anybody trying to do an OS. If you try to do an OS, and same with IBM before that, which Microsoft toppled, which was you try to make a computer hardware, you're not going to win.
Right.
So and then if you want to make a search engine, you're not going to win against Google. So it was a social media that came along. And so if you try to do social media now, anybody who's trying, you're not going to win.
Okay, but let me finish the argument. So still, while Microsoft has had the monopoly of what for a time was a very very important platform and is still non-trivial, it had it. And for decades, it had that monopoly. Now, the stakes aren't that high with a desktop OS because all it can do is do like bad design that wastes your time. But obviously, if you are the provider of knowledge and guidance, in other words, if you're the AI for everybody, while that platform lasts, if there's one provider, that's a kind of power well beyond what Microsoft. That's the power to swing elections. That's that's I think a much more consequential issue, which might bring some old-fashioned people to ask whether the word antitrust shouldn't come into play. But beyond that, it's not. And I know it's always the case that it's hard to imagine what displaces a platform, but I cannot readily imagine what displaces the AI. Now, maybe I just failed to grasp the point you're just making. I mean, it sounds like maybe you think you know what platform displaces AI. Or are you just saying that you can envision a future aspect of AI whose dominance cannot be taken for granted by the initial dominator of AI?
Right. It's AI that's much better. It's much more unsupervised, quicker learning. So if you don't need millions of sets of things to train it, and it can learn just with 12 examples, it's a superior kind of intelligence that would displace that existing monopoly. So
it can be so much better. Just to get clear, that I'd have Google Assistant. I'd rely on it for everything. Right. It would be on all my platforms. But this new company would come along with a faster AI, and I would say, okay, I will go to this. Even though Google Assistant would say to me, no, Bob, no.
Right.
Don't do it.
Exactly. Right. And in the same way that, everybody, I mean, I remember when Google came along, it was like, why do we need Google? We've got Alta Vista. It was like, because it was 10 times better. And immediately switched over. And now you're right, there's I think the switching cost would certainly be much higher if everybody's embedded and it knows this thing. So you have a personal assistant that really knows you. And so with this AI would have to be we can learn you faster. You're still going to be better off by moving. I can believe that as well. So that doesn't take away your point, which is that in the 10 years that there's a Google dominant AI, could it sway elections and et cetera? And I think in theory that is certainly possible. And I think it's like anything else, that the more powerful the technology, the more powerfully it can be abused. And so we will do well to, address these issues of, where does it have the power? How is it held accountable, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that I don't see anything inherent in this that suggests that it cannot be in some ways managed. I mean, just because here's the thing. I think one of the things that the Singularitarians are guilty of is what I call thinkism. Thinkism is this idea that you can solve problems or get things done just by thinking. And it comes from a lot of guys who like to think, right? And so this is the idea that if you had a really sufficient smart thing, it could solve cancer or something. You can't solve cancer with the little that we know about biology. You could have an AI that could read every single medical paper that ever existed, and it's not going to solve cancer because we just simply don't have enough. We have a whole bunch of more experiments that we have to do, which take time. And so this is the idea that, if we have an AI can do all these things just by thinking about it, I think is a mistake. That's thinkism. Okay. And so there's, just like the way you hack something is not to break the encryption, it's all the other things that have to interface with it. It's the same with an AI. Just the fact that it's really, really smart does not mean it's the end of the world, that it takes over, that it had lost our control. There's so many other ways that we interface and so many other consequences of this in the real world that we can use to manage it. I don't think it's unmanageable at all.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And you don't, I gather, buy the scenario kind of in the movie The Matrix, but one that's also been expressed by some prominent people lately, which is that we should worry about brilliant AI turning us, becoming our overlords and enslaving us, maybe even putting us into gooey cocoons and pumping dreams into our brains, as in the movie The Matrix. But in any event, the idea, and I have to admit, I always have trouble imagining this point at which, like, the AI starts doing something other than what we've programmed it to do, because surely we wouldn't program it to enslave us.
Right.
But unless you found the Matrix scenario attractive enough. But anyway, in some of these scenarios, the idea is, we don't want this to happen, but it happens. I have trouble imagining that, since we do program the AI. On the other hand, you yourself have said we cannot anticipate. There is some point beyond which it gets harder to anticipate what happens.
Absolutely. I mean, the way I would say about it is it's really hard to imagine it happening by accident, because I think even if we had it as our assignment, we would find it really difficult to do. Right? And so, but there is certainly, there are going to be unanticipated, unperceived aspects of this that will be very hard for us to control. And by the way, a lot of the initial AI, and this is happening already, makes decisions where we just don't know how it came to that decisions. And there's no mistake that the AIs are going to be making decisions. They're already making decisions, and they will make more decisions. And the part of the challenge that we have is, as we want to kind of reverse engineer or understand why it made a certain decision, so we can hold it accountable. And I suspect that in the long run, that we will have kind of like consciousness AIs. We'll have AIs that will watch AI to try and tell us, what is that AI doing? And we're only going to have another level of monitoring AI that's going to try to unravel the reasoning or the criteria or whatever it is of this AI, and that's kind of a form of a consciousness. And we might be able to have more accountability by using AIs to understand the other AIs. Mm-hmm. That's probably what we're going to do. Whether and it won't be something that necessarily we have full control over, just like we don't have full control over our children. And I think that's why this idea of kind of embedding into them ethics, morality, helping them make us better, I think is sort of what we're going to spend a lot of our time doing. I think that's going to become a necessary thing of what we're doing, of embedding our values. But the challenge is not embedding the values. I think that's very easy to do. The challenge is that we don't know what our values are well enough to embed. Ethically, we're really flimsy, shallow, inconsistent. And so in order to teach the AIs, the self-driving cars, ethics, requires us to be very clear about them so we can program, but we aren't clear about them. And that's the real challenge for us. It's not really transmitting them, but actually articulating them to ourselves.
Okay, but you think in principle, if we're clear on our ethics, then in a certain sense, are you saying that controlling the AI is in principle not such a great challenge? I mean, keeping it from doing something horrific to us is not such a great challenge, because you could embed foundational ethical principles, which presumably would include, like, hey, don't mess with us, and they would stick, they would hold. You think that's...
Yeah. Right, because one of the things that you do is don't mess with the ethics either, too. I mean,
right.
And so we have an existence proof this is possible, and it's called children. All right?
I don't know. Maybe you've had better luck controlling your children than I've had, but proceed, elaborate.
Right. Well, I mean, it's this. We have the same fears and the same challenges of having generations of children, which we're unleashing these free-willed agents that can do great harm, and not only that, but they're going to train their children. So it's like that's a scary prospect where there are these beings that can take us any way that's possible. So
okay. So I want to get back to the dystopia versus utopia versus protopia question, but let's pause and talk a little more about the texture of the book itself. Seems to me like the chapter that in a way best embodies the spirit of the book is the chapter called Flowing. And I mean that mainly just because it's called Flowing. I mean, there's this line in there that you say we're experiencing a, quote, grand move from fixity to flow. And you also say our routines and our infrastructure will be, quote, liquefied. To some extent, you find that same theme in other chapters, right?
Yes, and they're all codependent on each other. They're all feeding each other.
Mm-hmm.
There's this kind of a braided, long river with many tributaries that are all feeding into. So you could slice this in 12 different ways in a certain sense. Yes, I mean the more AI, the more VR, the more VR, the more flowing, the more screens, and they're all certainly codependent on each other. And this I mentioned this in the very beginning. This movement of from the nouns to the verbs, from the products to the processes, and that's part of what I'm trying to hint at with that language.
Okay. Now that chapter is itself largely about what happens when you can freely copy information and cultural products, books, songs, and so on. And I'm kind of tempted to say, in a certain sense, this isn't really a qualitative change because, in a way, in other words, ever since there were books, the deal has been that humans were, in a certain sense, the copying machines for the books. They are the replicators for the books. I read a book, I like it, I say to a friend, it's a good book, and now I don't create the new copy of the book, but the fact that I've said that makes the publisher more likely to print more copies. So there is this symbiotic relationship between us and the cultural products, and you can see things kind of flowing. It's just that they're flowing super slow, right. and there are a lot of constraints on how the flow can happen. Right. But anyway, you say that for practical purposes, we moved into a whole new kind of world, right? And what are some of the features of this world?
Yeah. So one of the things is that we, the West in particular, and maybe to the East to some extent, we have seen ourselves as people of the book, as a book-centric, a text-centric society, and even things like the root of authority comes from authors and the being able to put something down in writing. So putting things in writing was sort of like a seminal stake. And from that also came law, which was put into writing, which was fixed in that sense. You can't really cheat it. It says it here on paper. And so we have a whole kind of a culture that revolved around things that were fixed and done and precise and black and white and highly evolved, and that kind of precision founded our culture. And now we're kind of slipped into this world in which the screen and the things flowing across the screens are becoming the center of our society. And there you have books that are never done. They're kind of, they have versions. They're like Wikipedia that's just constantly being updated. You have things in which there's multiple versions, and you have facts. Even facts seem in some ways more slippery than before, and we don't have authorities very much. So this world in which information is flowing across the screen, never ending in updatable Facebook walls, the banners across the TV screen, your Twitter streams, all this kind of stuff, which is all flowing by. There doesn't seem to be at first the kind of fundamental gravitas, the authority of the book present in this world, and yet this is where we're moving to, and I think that changes fundamentally how we know things. I think that changes fundamentally what we think about the world, how we view even things that are ordinary, that we think is ordinary. That changes because we have this never-ending flow of superlatives, and that we're kind of inventing a culture around the screen that is where even how we assemble truth is something we have to assemble, so to speak, from this network of facts that gives us a new challenge in making sense of the world, gives us a new challenge in guiding our values, gives us a new challenge in even determining what we accept as being true and what we think we know.
Mm-hmm. Although you're optimistic about truth winning out.
I am. And let me just say something. You've mentioned my optimism a couple times. So I have I have very high. I'm 11 on the optimist scale, and my optimism is rooted in history. So the way I see history is that for the past at least a couple hundred years, even further, if we look at the evidence, if we just look at the scientific evidence, don't read the newspapers, look at the evidence, and almost every metric that humans care about, it's getting better very, very slowly. So this year was a tiny, tiny, tiny little bit better than last year. But that tiny delta is almost invisible for most purposes because this is very small. But that delta compounded annually is what makes civilization. And so for, let's say, for 200 years, we have had incremental progress. Now, it is possible that next year that stops. Next year, everything collapses. That's possible, but also unlikely. The probable state is that it will continue. Okay? And so I'm not discounting that people, that the possibility that we could have a collapse, but the probable is highly much more likely that it will continue, and that's where my optimism comes from. Is that it comes from the fact that these processes have been in place. They seem to be continuing, and while that progress is small on a yearly basis, it's real. Mm-hmm. And every bit of scientific evidence suggests that it's real, and therefore that reality will likely continue.
Okay, so here would be, I guess, be the counter argument. I mean, two things. That yes, there has been a lot of long run progress, and I myself have been known to chart this and emphasize it. But there have been these what you might call politely punctuations, right? I mean, mass atrocities. World War I, World War II. And the other thing I'd say is, like, when you reach, we've talked about a global superorganism, and I think that's the direction we're heading. I think it's less clear whether we'll succeed in really getting there. And the one reason is when you reach the global level, some of the traditional sources of social solidarity are gone. Traditionally, the cohesion of individual nations or alliances have depended on the existence of opposing alliances and nations. And we almost forgot that back when we were celebrating the end of the Cold War and saying, okay, party time. We didn't realize the extent to which the enmity between the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc had held those two blocs together. And now they're not together, and I'm not alone in looking around and thinking, we see a lot of fragmentation, divisiveness, and polarization. And in fact, some people attribute this to technology, and I think there's something to the argument that, for now at least, it seems we have used some of these technologies to cocoon ourselves into communities of like-minded people, and there's the people who watch Fox News and the people who watch MSNBC and so on. But at any rate, I guess there's two things going on. There's this empirical fact that these seem to be increasingly problematic times along a certain dimension. We won't even get into current American politics per se, but there's polarization and bitterness in a lot of countries right now, and between countries, between religious sects, and so on. And there's that observed fact, and there's just the kind of theoretical point that, wait a second, once you're at the global level of organization, it's an old science fiction motif that you need the invaders from Mars, right? And, the day the Earth stood still, and so on. So what do you say in response to both those observations about the current world and about past punctuations, and about the possibility that you get to this point and there's the possibility of a really epic punctuation? I mean, weapons of mass destruction, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think, though, that on the metrics that we're concerned about, that even those world wars, while they were horrific in the particulars, it didn't reflect necessarily setbacks. We'll call them setbacks in those other attributes that were slowly creeping in Protopia, I think it's entirely possible that we could have a hiccup at this juncture. But I
You're
have to
having
say,
a hiccup, Kevin. The question is whether it's a cold or.
no. But I spend a lot of time in other parts of the world, and my observation is that I don't see a hiccup. I don't see a hiccup in the development of the world as a whole. And again, I'm taking my statements here are all global.
And you spend a lot of time in Asia in particular, right?
Right, exactly. And I'm talking about there's pockets. Obviously, have always been pockets where there's going backwards. There's just like illness. It's just bad stuff. But as a global whole, I don't see this hiccup. I see still a very steady march of people living on average longer, of having more education, of better health, of more access to opportunities, which is really the only thing that I believe that technology brings us. More urbanization, more choices. I just don't see this. I have seen no evidence of this at the global scale of it stopping. There is certainly, political strife, and there's, places like Syria, which are a disaster, but that's not what we're measuring. Those are events on the planetary scale. Those are isolated events. Okay. They're horrific for the people involved, but I don't think it's stopping progress.
Okay, what about this argument? I think I think part of both your worldview and my worldview is that once evolution starts on a hospitable planet, a planet that's fairly hospitable to life, if the planet doesn't get blown away by asteroids or something, you're probably going to eventually get an intelligent species that generates culture. The culture is probably going to have a trajectory something like this. So if you assume that life, the birth of life on planets is not all that infrequent, and we're finding out from astronomy that there are more and more planets that could in principle have life, well, you would expect that we wouldn't be like at the very head of the class in terms of our advancement, and you might think there are really a number of planets that are more technologically advanced than us, and if they're very much technologically advanced than us, you'd think that they could send us a signal, but they seem not to have. One explanation for that is it's all true about the basic trajectory, but then when you get to the planetary scale, it's such a profound challenge to hold it together that not many pass the test. Have I converted you into pessimist successfully?
Yeah, no. I mean, I think that's a very, very possible scenario. The scenario that I actually think is that they have kind of a prime directive, and they're perfectly capable. And if you believe the UFOs are already here, but they don't. But they, they're so smart that they know that that's not a good thing to do. To basically to try to interfere with our development.
They want to observe us.
They'll observe us, but they are, except for some reckless teenagers who will zoom in and put on the lights. They're responsible. They're smart enough to be responsible to know that that's not.
Okay, so you think they may? Okay, so much for that argument. One more thing.
So Robert, why are you why do you really want to press the pessimistic view?
Because I think by nature I'm a little bit of a pessimist. There's that.
But you wrote a book called Non-Zero.
Hey, read that book closely. That book was as much a warning. It really was. I mean, a funny thing about that book, for people who don't know it, it was a book that posited a direction to said natural selection tends to produce blah, 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 likely to produce intelligent life. Technology takes over. And you very generously reviewed that in Wired, I think, by the way. But when people reacted to that by saying, what I said was, what has been inevitable? It's funny, we both had to define what we mean by inevitable, right? I said, what I think has been inevitable is that we would get to this point, but I consider this point a test and a profound, ultimately moral, you might even say spiritual challenge, because I think we have to become better than humans have been in terms of our ability to see things from the point of view of people and cultures halfway around the way, blah, 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 and quit starting wars because now we've got nukes. And so, and it's funny because that book was so universally depicted as optimistic, even though I had said this, that when it came out in paperback, I amended the introduction to drive home the concern. And I just want to emphasize, this was a few months before 9/11. I did not revise the paperback in response to 9/11. It was a few months before 9/11. So there's that. There's also, I think in that book that I said, look, I'm not conventionally religious, but when you look back and look at the history of life, it's not crazy to think that this is in some sense serving a purpose. It might be a god, it might be some hacker and it's a simulation, it might be some meta-natural selection process involving the replication of universes, and that you can sketch out plausible scenarios there, but whatever, I thought, seems to me this in some ways has a purpose. It could be that part of the purpose is us passing a moral test. There has been moral progress over history, I think, and maybe we're reaching this climax where, hey, you either get better, and maybe it's just for the amusement of some hacker, who knows, but still, if it's the case that, only if we improve morally will the whole thing survive, then I want to preach it. And I seem to have not succeeded so far, but it's my impulse. The other thing I'd say is, like, what's the downside? If I'm going to decide whether to be kind of optimistic or pessimistic, it seems to me like, what's the downside of somebody shouting, even if it turns out the warnings aren't needed? I'd rather have too many warnings than not enough, is what I'm saying.
Well, I actually have a different, naturally disagree. I believe the optimists in the end are the ones who decide the future, who plan the future, who make the future. And I think that if I'm, as you know, affiliated with the Long Now Foundation, where we are trying to foster long-term responsibility, long-term thinking. We don't really care particularly what your view is. It's just, let's take a long generational view. Let's do things that may take more than a generation to complete. Let's think about the grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Let's do things. Let's be good ancestors. And in that respect, you have to be optimistic, because you have to plan well for generations. You have to kind of believe that there's going to be generations ahead. And so I think I think people behave better overall when they're optimistic. And so in a certain sense, I think there's a moral duty to be optimistic.
Yeah, I personally think more damage has been done by people who overestimate the goodness of people than by people who underestimate it, which is related. But I'm all for the long now and getting people to think intergenerationally. I do think that even within that context, in terms of thinking about what blessings we can leave for future generations, if I had to reallocate resources within that space, I would say, look, global warming is absolutely important, making sure we have enough energy and blah, blah, blah. But I think not enough attention is being paid to the serious prospect that if we do not evolve morally, then these various, then this combination of non-state actors. I mean, we're living in an era where grassroots hatred, if it is combined with nuclear weapons or something, can do massive damage. And I think in light of that, it should be part of our concern for the long now and for future generations that we think more along the lines I'm suggesting, without neglecting any of the other serious concerns.
And I agree. I agree. In fact, but it may not surprise you, but I believe that one of the best tools that we will have for our moral progress is AI. And it's because of this, because I think in our process of trying to train it or teach it, we will become better ourselves. And just like most parents become better because of their children, not all. And I think that we also, I think AIs, as we invent consciousness and other things, also have the possibility of becoming moral agents and moral teachers in themselves. Mm-hmm. And so I can't prove any of that. That's total speculation. But I think it should go into the mix of what you look at into the future.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Final question. The different dimension of the dystopia question. The one of your chapters is called Accessing, and it's about kind of I think this is the one that's about kind of the Uber economy where you don't own so much stuff. You won't need to own a car. You'll call an automated vehicle when it shows up, and you won't, and so on. This is one of several chapters where the question naturally occurs to you, wait a second, if things are going to be different in this respect, what about all these people who used to make a living doing this? So
Right.
I wanted to just close by asking, I mean, you do say that, well, this will free people to do more creative, fulfilling things. But I do want to just close by asking you to look forward 20, 30, 40 years. What are people going to be doing instead of the things they're doing now?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's like asking the farmer, 70% of the American farmers farming, what are your kids going to be doing? There's no farmer that would say, oh, they're going to be web designers and mortgage brokers and yoga teachers. And so I think
You mean like 80 years ago or something? If you had asked farmers then, is that what you mean?
yeah, right, right. So this is the last question because I do see another call coming in, and I think we are going to invent new desires and new wishes and new things for us to do with the help of AIs and robots. And the things that we're going to give to them are things that we already are doing that we care about the efficiency and the productivity of it. And I think the kinds of things that humans are really good at are things where that's not important, and that includes human relationships. So this is not just jobs that you need a college degree for. I think even the kinds of things where we value like human relationship, like a 5-star chef meal, like concerts, singing, people sitting next to us when we're sick. All these things are the kinds of things that humans are really good at, and that we will continue to make up new occupations to do. I think we have no. I've never seen any kind of problem for us inventing up things that we want that we haven't wanted before.
Okay. Well, thank you. The book is The Inevitable. And where can people find you? You're on Twitter, Kevin?
I am Kevin 2 Kelly. My initials is the domain kk.org. All things there. So that's the place to look for me.
Well, thanks a million. We will see you next time.
Alrighty, great.